3 rounds went into Sergeant First Class Olivia Marchetti before her brain finished registering the first muzzle flash, and the world tilted sideways into a stinking irrigation ditch full of brown water and her own blood. She did not scream. She did not move. She lay there with her cheek pressed into the mud, eyes open a slit, watching 6 pairs of boots walk past her not 8 feet away, and she made the coldest decision of her entire life in the space of a single held breath. She decided to be dead, and for the next 13 years, she would let the United States Army believe she got that decision right. The water was warm. That was the first thing she noticed, in the part of her mind that hadn't shut down from shock. The irrigation water was warm as bathwater, June in Anbar province, and it was filling up around her ribs and soaking into the holes the rounds had punched through her. She could feel the heat leaving her on one side and the cold creeping in on the other, and she knew exactly what that meant. She'd seen it in other people. She'd held pressure on it. She knew the math of blood loss the way she knew the field strip of an M4, and the math was telling her she had maybe 20 minutes before the light started to dim for good. So she lay still, and she counted the boots. 6 fighters moving through the ditch line, weapons up, sweeping the village edge where the firefight had broken open 90 seconds ago. They were talking low, fast, in Arabic she understood about a third of, and she caught the word for American, and she caught the word for woman, and she understood enough to know they were looking for her specifically. Not for an American. For the American woman. The one they'd been hearing about. The one whose presence on this team had been an open secret in 3 villages. The one a certain field commander had been promising his men he'd put on camera one day, kneeling, alive, a trophy worth more than a dozen dead Marines. Olivia Marchetti understood, lying in that ditch with 3 rounds in her, that being found alive would be infinitely worse than being found dead. Let me back this up, friend, because you need to understand what you're looking at before I let it run forward. My name doesn't matter. What matters is I spent 30 years in and around Army Special Forces, and I've read a lot of files in my time, the kind that come with a black bar across half the page and a stamp that means you weren't supposed to be reading it at all. And every so often you find one that doesn't end where the official record says it ends. You find a date of death and a body count and a folded flag and a silver star going into some mother shaking hands at a funeral home in New Jersey, and then you find 300 pages and 13 years later, the same name showing up again, alive, signing a debriefing statement in a clean conference room at Fort Bragg. Same fingerprints, same dental, same woman. They identified her body. They folded the flag into a perfect triangle, 13 folds, the way they teach you. They put a silver star in her mother's hands, and they called it closure, and the whole United States Army moved on. There was just one problem with all of it. She was alive in a basement in Anbar, listening to her own funeral on a shortwave radio. And she let them finish it. You sit with that for a second. I want you to actually sit with it, because it's easy to hear those words and let them slide right off. A woman lay in a hole in the desert with 3 bullets in her, made it out alive against odds that would make a Vegas bookie laugh you out of the building. And then, when she found out the army thought she was dead, when she found out her own mother had been handed a flag and a medal and a casket, she made a choice. She chose to stay dead. Not because she was a prisoner. Not because someone forced her. By her own free will, with both eyes open, she decided that the most useful thing Sergeant Olivia Marchetti could possibly do for her country was stop existing. I've known a lot of brave people. I've known people who threw themselves on grenades, and people who walked into buildings everybody else was running out of. But I'll tell you something, I don't know that I've ever known anybody brave enough to do what this woman did, which was to volunteer to be a ghost, to give up her own name, to let the people who loved her grieve her in the ground, knowing the whole time she could end their grief with a single phone call, and choosing, year after year after year, not to make it. This is the story of the dead woman who wasn't. And I'm going to tell it to you the way it actually happened, from that ditch in June of 2009 all the way to a quiet hangar at Pope Field in the autumn of 2022, where a colonel who'd waited 13 years finally got to say her real name out loud. Stick with me to the end of this one, friend, because the part that's going to stay with you isn't the bullets, and it isn't the basement. It's what she did when they finally said, Marchetti, and she didn't have to correct them. But first you have to understand who she was before she died, because you don't make the choice Liv Marchetti made unless the army got into your blood a long time before Anbar ever did. Olivia Marchetti came up in a row house in Hoboken, New Jersey, the kind of neighborhood where everybody's grandfather had come over from the old country and everybody's father worked with his hands, and everybody's mother fed the entire block on Sundays whether you'd asked to be fed or not. The Marchettis were Calabrian on her father's side, 3 generations deep in the same 6 blocks, and Liv grew up the youngest of 4 and the only girl, which meant she learned early that the only way to get heard at that dinner table was to be twice as loud, twice as quick, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Her father, Sal, ran a plumbing and heating business out of a van and a garage, and from the time she was 9, he had her holding the flashlight under sinks, then handing him wrenches, then, by the time she was 14, running solder joints herself while he watched and grunted, which from Sal Marchetti was the highest praise a human being could earn. Her mother, Rosa, was the warmth and the law of that house in equal measure, a woman who could pull you into a hug that smelled like garlic and basil, and in the same motion let you know with one look that you had disappointed her past the point of words. Liv loved her mother with the fierce, complicated love of a daughter who is too much like her mother to ever fully get along with her. She was not a soft kid. She played soccer like it owed her money. She fought with her brothers, and usually won, and she had a stubborn streak so deep that her father used to say God had built her out of leftover concrete. But underneath the toughness there was something her teachers saw before her family did, a kind of stillness, a watchfulness. Liv noticed things. She noticed when the new kid sat alone. She noticed when a teacher was about to lose patience, and she noticed which of the older boys on the block had started carrying themselves different, harder, with that flat-eyed look that meant trouble was coming to the neighborhood. She read people the way other kids read comic books, fluently, without effort, all the time. It was September of her senior year of high school when 2 planes came out of a clear blue morning and put a hole in the skyline she'd grown up looking at across the river. Hoboken sits right on the Hudson, close enough that on a normal day you could see the towers from the waterfront. Liv was in second period chemistry when the first one hit, and by the time school let out the city across the water was burning, and the sky over Manhattan was the wrong color, and the whole neighborhood stood out on the piers in a silence she would never forget, watching the smoke, smelling it when the wind turned. 3 men from her parish died that day. One of them was the father of a girl she'd played soccer with since they were 6 years old. She didn't enlist out of some movie poster idea of revenge. She wasn't that kind of person, even at 17. But something settled into her in the weeks after, something that didn't shake loose. She'd been raised by a man who believed that when something was broken, you were obligated to fix it, that walking away from a broken thing was a kind of cowardice. And the world had broken in a way she could see from her own front porch. She finished high school. She enrolled in a year of community college to keep her mother from having a stroke. And then one Tuesday morning she drove herself to a recruiting office in a strip mall on Route 1 and signed papers for the United States Army, and she did not tell her family until it was done. Rosa cried for a week. Sal didn't speak to her for 3 days, which was the loudest thing that man could do, and then on the 4th day he came down to the garage where she was loading her stuff, and he handed her his own father's pocket watch, the one that had come over on the boat from Calabria, and he said one sentence. "You come home, Olivia. Whatever it is, whatever they ask, you come home." And then he hugged her so hard she felt her ribs creak, and that was Sal Marchetti's blessing, and she carried the watch and those words for the rest of her life. I'm going to stop here for just a second, because there's a phrase Liv used years later in a debriefing room, and it tells you everything about the kind of soldier she became. She said her instructor in Sears School, that survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, the course where they teach you how to stay alive and stay quiet when everything has gone to hell, she said her instructor was a master sergeant named Reeves, and Reeves had a saying he grind into every class. The body lies last, he'd tell them. The eyes lie first. You want to know if a man's about to kill you, don't watch his hands. Watch his eyes. The hands are just the messenger. Liv never forgot it. She built a whole second life on the back of that one sentence, on the gap between what people show you and what's actually true. The eyes lie first. The body lies last. Remember that, friend. It's going to matter more than you think. Liv Marchetti was good at being a soldier from the very first day, and not in the loud way that gets you noticed and burns out by the second deployment. She was good in the quiet way. She was the private who already had her gear squared away, while everybody else was still cussing at their lockers. She was the one who actually read the manual, who could field strip and reassemble her weapon blindfolded, not because somebody made her, but because she decided that her hands should know it better than her eyes. Her drill sergeants noticed her the way good drill sergeants notice the dangerous ones, not the kid who's trying hardest, but the kid who's already operating 2 clicks ahead of the curriculum. She started out as a 31B military police, because that's a field that was open to women in those years, and it suited her. It was investigative. It was about reading situations and reading people, and she was already a natural at both. She did her first tour in 2005, and she was good enough and steady enough that her chain of command kept finding reasons to put her where the situation was most fluid, most uncertain, most likely to require somebody who could think instead of just react. By her second deployment, she was being attached to units doing village stability work, sitting in on key leader engagements, because somebody up the food chain had figured out something that the Army, as an institution, was still very slow to admit out loud, that in that part of the world, a female soldier could go places, see things, and talk to people that no male soldier on Earth could reach. Half the population of every village they worked in was women, and those women were invisible to the American military. A male soldier couldn't search them, couldn't really speak to them, couldn't sit in their kitchens and hear the things that women hear and women know. But Liv could. Liv could walk into a compound and within 20 minutes have 3 Iraqi women talking to her over tea, telling her things, who'd come through last night, whose son had stopped coming home, which house had new men in it who weren't from around there. Intelligence that you could not buy and could not torture out of anybody, freely given, because a woman had bothered to treat them like human beings. Liv brought back gold on those rotations, and the right people started to take notice. And here's where her story turns, because somewhere in there a Special Forces officer doing assessment work in her sector read her reports, sat in on one of her engagements, and went looking for her afterward. Special Forces, the Green Berets, had a problem they couldn't solve with the manpower they had. Their whole mission was unconventional warfare, working by, with, and through local populations, and half of any local population was women and children that 12 burly men with beards simply could not access. So a program had quietly grown up to attach specially selected female soldiers to Special Forces teams, to do exactly what Liv had been doing, but deeper, more dangerous, fully integrated into the team's operations. Cultural support teams, they called them in some iterations. The women who went through it were vetted and trained to a standard that broke most candidates, and they deployed right alongside the ODAs, the Operational Detachment Alphas, the 12-man Green Beret teams, into the worst places this country sent anybody. The selection course nearly killed her, and she would tell you later it was the best thing that ever happened to her. It was land navigation through terrain designed to break your spirit. It was sleep deprivation and stress inoculation, and a psychological gauntlet built specifically to find the place where you quit and then push you 100 meters past it. It was that SEER course, where Master Sergeant Reeves stood in front of a room of exhausted, half-starved candidates and taught them how to disappear, how to survive off nothing, how to resist when there was nothing left to resist with. The body lies last. The eyes lie first. Liv was one of a small number who made it all the way through, and at the end of it, she was something the United States Army had very few of in those years. A woman trained, qualified, and cleared to deploy as a full operational asset attached to 5th Special Forces Group. She was assigned to an ODA out of Fort Campbell, and she had to earn her place on that team the hard way, which is the only way Green Berets respect anybody. 12 men who'd been doing this for years, some of them on their 5th and 6th combat tours, and into the middle of that walks a 30-year-old woman from New Jersey who's there to be one of them. They didn't make it easy. They weren't supposed to. The team sergeant, a leathery old warrant officer's worth of experience packed into a senior NCO named Cobb, ran her through every kind of test there is, the loud ones and the quiet ones, the ones she could see and the ones she couldn't, and lived past all of them the same way she'd passed everything else her whole life. She showed up early, she carried her own weight, and then some. She never complained, and the first time the team got into real contact she did her job so calmly and so well that a couple of the men who'd been the loudest skeptics came and found her afterward and shook her hand and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. There was one man on that team who became something more than a teammate to her, and you need to know about him because he's going to walk back into this story in a big way. His name was Frank Aiello. He was a captain then, the detachment commander, the ODAs, team leader, Italian kid from Boston, which gave the two of them an instant shorthand, two paesani in the middle of the desert who both knew what a real Sunday gravy was supposed to taste like, and both had mothers who'd have fought to the death over whether you call it gravy or sauce. Aiello was the kind of officer the good NCOs actually wanted, which is to say he listened more than he talked, he trusted his sergeants, and he had an absolute, bone-deep loyalty to the people under him that went past regulation, past career, past everything. He saw what Liv was within the first month. He fought to keep her on the team when the bureaucracy tried to rotate her out. And the two of them built the kind of trust that you only build in the worst places on earth, The kind where you've each held the other's life in your hands and handed it back intact. It was not romantic. I want to be clear about that, because the world is cheap and it always wants to make it romantic. It was deeper than that and cleaner than that. It was the thing soldiers mean when they say a word like brother, and mean it more than they mean it about their actual blood. Frank Aiello would have walked into hell for Olivia Marchetti, and she for him, and neither of them ever had to say it.
Hold on to that, friend, because 13 years from the moment we're about to get to, it's going to be Frank Aiello who refuses to let her stay buried. It's going to be Frank Aiello who looks a dead woman in the eye and tells her it's time to be alive again. But in June of 2009, none of that had happened yet. In June of 2009, the team was working a cluster of villages in Anbar province, deep in the part of the war that doesn't make the news. The slow grinding work of stability operations in a place where the front line was every doorway and the enemy looked exactly like the people you were there to protect. And there was a man working that same ground against them, a local field commander, a militia leader with bigger ambitions than most, a man who had figured out that in this war the camera was a weapon as deadly as any rifle. He'd been building a reputation on propaganda, on staged videos, on turning every American mistake and every American death into content that recruited more fighters and demoralized more locals. And he had heard, the way everyone in that valley had heard, that the American team working his ground had a woman on it. To him, that wasn't a soldier. That was an opportunity. The American woman, on camera, captured alive. That was the kind of footage that would make him famous from Anbar to Kandahar. He had told his men, more than once, that he wanted her taken alive. Killed was good. Killed was propaganda. But taken alive was a kingmaker. Lid knew about him. The team knew about him. They knew his name, and they knew his methods, and they knew that he wanted her specifically, and that knowledge was sitting in the back of Olivia Marchetti's mind on the morning everything went wrong, which is why, when the bullets came, and the world tilted into that ditch, she understood her situation with a clarity that most dying people never get. The mission that day was supposed to be routine, which is a word that should be banned from the military vocabulary because nothing is ever routine, and the day they tell you it is the day you should be most afraid. The team was moving into a village at the edge of their operating area to follow up on a tip, a meeting, intelligence suggested, between local power brokers, the kind of engagement where Liv's presence was the whole point because half the people they needed to talk to were women. They went in the way they always did, careful, spread out. Two of the local Iraqi army soldiers they'd been training out front, the ODA flowing through the streets in a loose, watchful diamond, lived near the center where she could move to whichever compound the engagement materialized in. It was an ambush. It was a good one, and a good ambush means somebody talked, somebody on the inside, and they'd walked into it because the intelligence that brought them there had been bait. The first burst of fire came from a rooftop and dropped one of the Iraqi soldiers in the street, and then the whole village opened up at once, fire coming from 3 directions, the kill box closing exactly the way it's supposed to. The team did what Green Berets do, which is the opposite of what your nervous system screams at you to do. They didn't freeze, and they didn't run. They turned into the ambush and started fighting their way through it, putting down a base of fire, moving in bounds, calling it out, fighting like the professionals they were. But 2 men went down in the first 60 seconds. One took a round through the thigh that opened his femoral, and the other caught fragmentation across his back and neck when an RPG hit the wall behind him. 2 men down, both alive but both unable to move under their own power, in the open, with fire pouring in. And the team had to get them out, had to get everyone to the casualty collection point and the vehicles. And to do that, somebody had to hold the corner. Somebody had to put enough fire down the eastern approach to keep the enemy's heads down long enough for the others to drag the wounded across 40 meters of open ground to cover. Olivia Marchetti held that corner. She got behind a low mud wall at the eastern corner of the street, and she went to work, and the men who survived that day would tell you for the rest of their lives that what she did in those next 4 minutes was the bravest thing any of them ever saw. She fired in controlled bursts, moving after every few rounds, never staying in the same spot long enough for them to fix her, making one woman look like 3. She made the enemy think the corner was held in strength. She drew their fire onto herself and away from the open ground where Cobb and 2 other men were dragging the wounded back, and she kept it up, calm and methodical, calling out targets over the radio between bursts in a voice so level you'd have thought she was running a range. She held it long enough. That's the thing you have to understand. She held that corner long enough that both wounded men made it to cover, long enough that the team got organized, long enough that the medevac got called and the extraction started coming together. She did the math the way she always did the math, and she stayed exactly as long as she needed to and not 1 second longer. And then, when it was time to break contact and fall back to the vehicles, she made her move. And that's when they got her. She was crossing the last gap, the last few meters of exposure between her wall and the alley where the team was consolidating, when the rounds came in from a position she hadn't seen, off to her flank, a shooter who'd repositioned during the fight. 3 rounds. 1 through the left shoulder, 1 through the side just below the ribs, 1 that grazed deep across her back as she was already falling. The impact spun her and dropped her, and she went down hard into the irrigation ditch that ran along the base of the wall, down into that warm brown water, out of sight of the alley, out of sight of her team. And here is the moment everything turns on. Here is the hinge that the next 13 years swings from. The team didn't see her go down into the ditch. From the alley, in the chaos and the smoke and the noise, what they saw was Marchetti crossing the gap, and then Marchetti gone, dropped, vanished, into a sector that was now under heavy fire. Cobb tried to push back toward her, and nearly got himself killed for it. The enemy had that whole eastern approach locked down. Aiello was screaming her name on the radio and getting nothing back, because Liv's radio had taken 1 of the rounds and was dead, and because Liv, lying in that ditch with the water rising around her wounds, had already made her first decision, which was to not make a sound. She heard them calling her. She heard Aiello's voice cracking on the net, heard Cobb trying to fight his way to her, and she understood with that terrible clarity that if they came for her now, into that kill box, more of them would die. The enemy wanted exactly that. The enemy was holding the ground specifically to draw the Americans back into the open to recover their fallen. It's an old trick, and it works because it preys on the one thing that makes these teams what they are, which is that they will not leave you. They will die trying to bring you home. The enemy knew it and was counting on it. So Liv made a choice that cost her everything and saved at least 2 lives. She stayed silent. She stayed down. She let her team believe she was dead or dying in a place they couldn't reach, because the alternative was watching them feed themselves into a meat grinder to recover her, and she would not be the reason another one of them went home in a box. The hardest order she ever gave in her life was the one she gave to herself, lying in that ditch. Stay quiet, stay still, let them go. Aiello held them as long as he could. He held them until the casualties forced the issue, until staying meant losing the whole team, And then he made the worst decision of his career, which was to order the withdrawal with one of his people unaccounted for in enemy hands. He called it in. Marchetti down, last seen taking effective fire crossing the eastern gap, unrecovered. He pulled his team out, got his 2 wounded to the bird, and he carried the weight of leaving her there for 13 years, every single day, like a stone sewn into his chest. And in the ditch, the water kept rising, and the boots kept passing, and Liv Marchetti lay still, and counted them, and waited to either die or get the chance to live, and she honestly did not know which one she was hoping for. The enemy swept the village for hours. She heard them. She heard them go through the compounds, heard them moving along the ditch line more than once, heard them right above her at one point, close enough that she could smell the cigarette one of them was smoking. She had her sidearm in the water, in her hand, under the surface, and she had made a third decision by then, which was that they were not going to take her alive. Master Sergeant Reeves had taught her in that SEER course exactly what capture meant for someone like her, and she had decided in the ditch, fully and finally, that it was not going to happen. If they found her, she'd take as many of them as she could and save the last round, and she'd made her peace with that with a calm that frightened her a little, even then. But they didn't find her. The ditch was deep, and the water was filthy, and the reeds along the bank were thick, and she'd gone in at exactly the right angle, mostly submerged, her dark hair and mud-caked uniform blending into the muck. They walked past her a dozen times. The American woman they wanted so badly was 8 feet away from them for the better part of a day, bleeding into the water they used to grow their crops, and they never knew it. By the time the sun went down and the village went quiet, Liv Marchetti was still alive, which she had not expected, and she was faced with the problem of what to do about it. She did what Reeves had taught her. She did what the whole brutal pipeline that had made her had taught her. She survived. The first night, she crawled. She couldn't walk. The wound in her side had her breathing in short stabs, and the shoulder was useless, and she'd lost enough blood that the edges of her vision kept going dark and starry. But she could crawl, and so she crawled, out of the ditch, and into the irrigated fields, moving by feel and by stars, away from the village, away from the road, deeper into the agricultural belt where the canals and the crops gave cover. She moved a few hundred meters, and went to ground before first light, hid herself in an irrigation culvert, and lay there through the whole burning day, conserving everything, sucking moisture from the canal water, and trying not to die of the infection she could already feel building in her side. The next night, she crawled again. 9 nights she did that. 9 nights of crawling through the dark, hiding through the day, drinking ditch water, eating raw what little she could find, packing mud into her wounds because mud was all she had, and somewhere in her training somebody had told her that the clay in some of these soils had antibacterial properties, and she had nothing to lose by believing it. She was delirious by the 3rd night, having whole conversations with her father, with Aiello, with people who weren't there. Master Sergeant Reeves walked beside her in the fields for most of one night, telling her the body lies last, telling her to keep her eyes open, telling her that she was not allowed to quit because quitting was a decision, and she didn't have permission to make it. She kept her father's pocket watch in her fist the whole time. The one Sal had pressed into her hand in the garage, and on the worst nights she'd hold it so tight the casing cut into her palm, just to feel something that wasn't pain or fear. She should have died out there. By every law of medicine and probability, she should have died in those fields, of blood loss or sepsis or sheer exhaustion. She'll tell you herself she doesn't fully understand why she didn't. But on the 9th night, half dead, Out of her mind with fever, she crawled up against the wall of a farm compound at the very edge of the agricultural belt, and she didn't have the strength to go around it or over it, so she just lay against it and waited to die, and that's where the farmer found her at dawn. And here, friend, is where this story gets its first miracle, and it's a quiet one, the kind that doesn't make movies, but makes the difference between life and death. Because the farmer who found a dying American soldier against his wall that morning was a man named Yusuf, and Yusuf knew exactly who she was. Not by name, by face. Because 18 months earlier, in a different village, Olivia Marchetti had done something she'd forgotten about almost immediately, the way you forget the small decencies, and Yusuf had not forgotten it for a single day. His youngest son had been badly sick, dying really, of a fever and a swelling that the local clinic had no answer for, and Liv had been the American who'd sat with the boy, who'd radioed for help, who'd gotten the team medic to come, who'd arranged for the child to be moved to a facility that could treat him. The boy had lived, and Yusuf, looking down at the broken, bleeding, mud-caked wreck of a woman dying against his wall, recognized the American who had saved his son, and he did not hesitate for 1 second. He carried her inside. He hid her. And that simple act of one man's gratitude, repaid across 18 months and the chaos of a war, is the reason Olivia Marchetti lived to become a ghost. Let me stop the story right here for a minute, because I want you to understand something about what just happened, the part you might skate right past. You're sitting there thinking about the bullets, and the crawling and the fever, and those are the dramatic parts, sure. But the thing that actually saved her life wasn't her toughness. It wasn't the SEER training. It wasn't even the luck of the ditch. The thing that saved Olivia Marchetti's life was a kindness she'd done 1.5 years earlier and never thought about again. I've been doing this a long time, and I'll tell you the math of it, because there's always a math. Every soldier who deploys into a place like that makes 1,000 small choices that nobody orders them to make. You can do the mission and nothing more, treat the locals like furniture, get in and get out, and keep your head down. And plenty do, and you can't entirely blame them, because the world they're in is trying to kill them. Or you can be the kind of soldier who sits with a sick kid, who learns the names, who treats people like people even when it's not in the operation order, even when it costs you sleep and energy you don't have to spare. That kind of soldiering doesn't show up in any metric the Army tracks. There's no medal for it. There's no line on the evaluation. And then one morning you're dying against a stranger's wall in the middle of enemy territory, and it turns out that all those small unrewarded decencies were the only insurance policy that ever mattered. The eyes lie first, Reeves used to say, and the body lies last. But Liv had figured out something Reeves never put into words, that the deepest truth about a person, the one that survives everything, is who they were when nobody was keeping score. Yusuf had seen who she was when nobody was keeping score. And 18 months later, that's what walked her back from the dead. Remember that the next time somebody tells you the soft skills don't win wars. Hold that thought. Now back to the basement, because she's not safe yet, not even close. Yusuf hid her in the cellar of his compound, a low dirt-walled room where the family stored grain and oil, and for the first weeks he and his wife, a quiet, fierce woman named Amira, kept her alive more or less by sheer will. They had no real medicine. They had what was in the village, which was almost nothing, and they had Amira's knowledge of how to treat a wound when there's no clinic for 50 miles, and no clinic you dare go to anyway, because going to a clinic would mean answering questions about the American woman bleeding in your house. Amira packed the wounds, drained the infection in the side. When it came to a head, kept the fever down with cool cloths through the worst of it, and fed her broth a spoonful at a time when Liv couldn't keep anything else down. There was a stretch of about 10 days where nobody in that house expected her to live, and Amira nursed her through it anyway, and Yusuf prayed over her in a language Liv didn't fully understand, and somehow, slowly, she didn't die. It took her months to be able to walk across the cellar. Months more before the side healed enough that she could draw a full breath without it feeling like a knife. The shoulder never fully came back. She carried the limited range of motion the rest of her life, and on cold days, the shoulder would ache and remind her exactly where she'd been. But she lived. Through the back half of 2009 and well into 2010, Olivia Marchetti lived in a hole in the ground in Anbar province, hidden by a family who would have been killed, all of them, the children included, if anyone had discovered what they were sheltering. She knew the risk they were taking. It was the thing that tormented her most in those long months, more than the pain, more than the fear, that her continued existence was a death sentence hanging over the heads of the people keeping her alive. And that's the context in which she heard about her own funeral. Yusuf had a radio. An old shortwave, the kind that pulls in signals from half the world on a good night, and through it the household kept some thin connection to the outside. And one evening, maybe 4 months into her time in the cellar, Yusuf came down the steps with a strange look on his face, and he had the radio with him, and he set it down and found a frequency and gestured for her to listen. It was an English-language broadcast, one of the international services, and they were running a segment, a feature piece, a human interest story, the kind they do, about America's war dead, about the women, specifically, about the small but growing number of female American soldiers who were dying in these wars in roles the public didn't fully understand yet. And in the middle of that segment, the announcer said her name. Sergeant First Class Olivia Marchetti, 32 years old, of Hoboken, New Jersey, killed in action in Anbar province. Awarded the Silver Star, posthumously, for conspicuous gallantry, for holding a position under overwhelming fire to enable the evacuation of 2 wounded comrades, at the cost of her own life. Survived by her parents, Salvatore and Rosa, and 3 brothers. The announcer's voice was warm and grave and respectful, and he read a line that Liv recognized, because it was a line from her own award citation, and she understood as she sat in that cellar that somewhere across an ocean, weeks or months ago, her mother had stood in a funeral home and been handed a folded flag and a medal, and had buried her daughter. Except her daughter was sitting in a hole in the ground in a rock, alive, listening to the whole thing on the radio. I have tried for a long time to imagine what that does to a person, and I don't think I can. To hear your own death announced. To hear the official, government-stamped, internationally broadcast confirmation that you are gone, that the people you love have grieved you, that there is a stone somewhere with your name on it, and a flag in a triangle case on your mother's mantle, and a medal in a box that your father can't bring himself to look at. To hear all of that, and to be alive, and to know, this is the part that takes my breath away, to know that you could end it, that you could send word, that somewhere in the machinery of the United States military there were channels, ways, methods, and that if you fought hard enough and risked enough you could get a message out that said, I am alive, come and get me, and they would move heaven and earth to do exactly that. She could have ended her own death with a word. And she sat in that cellar, and she thought about it for a long time, and she made the decision that defines this entire story. She decided to stay dead. Now I need you to understand why, because if you don't understand why,
you'll think she was running from something, and she wasn't. This wasn't a woman fleeing her life. This was a woman doing the coldest, clearest cost-benefit analysis of her existence, and arriving at a conclusion that almost no one on earth would have the strength to act on. Here was her thinking, and I've pieced it together from what she said years later in those debriefing rooms. First, the enemy field commander, the propaganda man, the one who'd wanted her alive, he had already turned her death into a weapon. Within days of the ambush, he'd put out his own version, claiming his fighters had killed the American woman, the female Green Beret, making it a recruiting triumph, a sign of God's favor, proof the Americans were so desperate they were sending their women to die. Her death was already propaganda. And Liv, sitting in that cellar, had a thought that most people would never have. If my death is this useful to him, then my death is a tool I now possess. A dead woman can go anywhere. A dead woman has no record, no fingerprints anyone's looking for, no face on any watch list, because she's already accounted for, already buried. The single most valuable thing an intelligence asset can have is to not exist, and the United States Army had just declared, officially and internationally, that Olivia Marchetti did not exist anymore. Second, and this cut deeper, she knew the cost of coming back. She knew exactly what would happen if she surfaced. The first female Green Beret to be captured and survive, the woman the enemy had built propaganda around, returning from the dead, she would be the biggest story in the war. There would be no quiet return. She'd be a symbol, a headline, a political object fought over by people who'd never met her. Worse, the very program that had put her on that team, the integration of women into special forces operations, was fragile, controversial, hanging by a thread of careful results. A spectacle around her, a captured woman, a tortured woman, a damaged returning woman, could be the thing that killed the whole program. Everything she and the women like her had fought to build could be set back a decade by the circus her resurrection would become. She'd be the reason the door closed on the women coming up behind her. And third, the one she could barely look at directly. Her team was still out there. ILO Cobb, all of them, still in the fight, still working the ground. The networks they'd built, the sources, the local relationships, the slow, patient work of years, all of it was still in motion. And she was sitting on the inside of something now, hidden in the heart of enemy territory, fluid enough, trained enough, and most importantly invisible enough to do things that no living, documented American soldier could ever do. She could see a way to keep working, to keep fighting, to turn her own death into the deepest cover any operator ever had. She thought about her mother for a long time before she decided. She would tell you that the image of Rosa Marchetti receiving that flag was the single hardest thing she ever had to set aside, and that she never fully set it aside, that it lived in her like a splinter too deep to dig out, for 13 years. But Liv Marchetti had been raised by a man who believed that when something is broken, you are obligated to fix it, and that walking away from broken work is a kind of cowardice. And she looked at the broken thing in front of her, the war, the work, the door she could either hold open or let slam shut, and she made the choice her father had built into her bones. She let them finish the funeral. She let her mother grieve. And she went to work in the dark. What Olivia Marchetti did over the next 11 years is a thing I can only tell you in pieces, partly because a lot of it is still behind the black bar on the page, and partly because that's exactly how she did it, in pieces, in the dark, never the whole picture in any one place. She didn't do it alone, and she didn't do it freelance. That's a Hollywood idea,
and it would have gotten her killed in a month. What actually happened is harder to explain and, to my mind, far more remarkable. She didn't stay dead in a vacuum. She found a way to make contact, not with her team, not with anybody who knew her, but sideways, carefully, through the world of human intelligence, the world of case officers and assets and handlers that runs underneath the war you read about. She made contact with one man, an intelligence officer working the region, and she made him a proposition that took him most of a year to believe and to verify and to get the right people to sign off on, and it was this: I am dead. The army has buried me. The enemy thinks they killed me. I am the only American in this entire theater that no one is looking for, because everyone already knows where I am, in the ground in New Jersey. Use me. It is, when you sit with it, the most efficient cover identity ever constructed, because it wasn't an identity at all. It was an absence. There was no false name to maintain, no legend that could crack under scrutiny, no documents that could be forged badly. There was simply a woman who, as far as every record in the world was concerned, no longer existed. The few people who knew the truth could be counted on one hand, and they were chosen and compartmented with a paranoia that bordered on the religious. Her own family didn't know. Her own team didn't know. ILO, grinding through his guilt year after year, did not know. The number of human beings on Earth who knew that Olivia Marchetti was alive stayed in the single digits for over a decade, and that was not an accident. That was the entire point. I'm not going to pretend to you that I know every operation she touched. I don't, and the ones I do know I can't lay out in detail, but I can give you the shape of it. She worked the human terrain. That had always been her gift. The women's networks, the kitchens, the things that pass between people in a culture the American military mostly couldn't see into. As a ghost, she could go deeper into that than any living asset ever could. She could move through the population in a way that a documented soldier never could, because she had no profile to protect, no extraction plan to compromise, no chain of command tracking her position. She lived rough for long stretches, in safe houses and worse, and she fed information up the chain that, over the years, helped roll up networks and find people who needed finding and save lives in operations where the people whose lives were being saved never had the faintest idea that a dead woman had reached out of the grave to do it. She had a hand, and I'll say only this much. She had a hand in the eventual undoing of the very man who'd wanted to put her on camera. The propaganda commander, the field leader who'd built his reputation partly on her death. He never knew it. He never knew that the American woman he'd boasted of killing spent years quietly pulling threads loose from the network around him, mapping the people who moved his money and made his videos and protected his movements. When they finally got him, years later, it was a clean operation, well-sourced, the kind that works because somebody on the inside has spent a very long time learning everything there is to know. He went to his death certain he'd killed Olivia Marchetti in an irrigation ditch in 2009. He had no idea she'd been one of the people who killed him. I find a great deal of justice in that, and so, I think, did she, though she never gloated about it, not even years later in that conference room. She just said, "We got him," and the "we" was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the "we" included a version of herself nobody knew existed. But I don't want to make this sound clean, because it wasn't. There's a cost to being a ghost, and the cost is your soul, dollar by dollar, year by year, and nobody hands you a receipt. Think about what she gave up. Not just her name. She gave up being known. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being a person whom no one on earth knows is alive,
and lived inside that loneliness for over a decade. She couldn't call her mother. Not once. Not on Rosa's birthday. Not at Christmas. Not on the bad nights when she'd have given a limb just to hear that voice say her name. She knew Rosa was out there, getting older, grieving a daughter who wasn't dead, and she had decided, for reasons she believed in, for reasons that were genuinely good, that the kindest and most necessary thing she could do for her own mother was to let her go on believing the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Every day Liv didn't make that call was a day she chose the mission over her mother again. 11 years of that. Thousands of days, each one a fresh small act of self-denial that no medal in the world covers. She missed her father's death. That's the one that I think nearly broke her, from what I understand. Sal Marchetti, the man who'd pressed his own father's watch into her hand and told her to come home, whatever it took. Sal died of a heart attack about 6 years into her time as a ghost. And word of it reached her, eventually, sideways, the way everything reached her, weeks after the fact. Her father was dead and buried, and she had not been there, and she could not be there, and she could not even let her mother and her brothers know that one of the people grieving him from a distance was the daughter they'd buried 6 years before. She kept that watch on her the whole time, the watch he told her to bring home. And she would tell you, years later, in the only moment in any of those debriefings where her voice cracked, that the hardest day of her entire life, harder than the ditch, harder than the fever, harder than the funeral on the radio, was the day she learned her father had died, still believing she was dead, still grieving her, never knowing that she'd made it out of that ditch and lived. "I came home," she said in that room, very quietly. "I came home, Pop. I just couldn't tell you." And then she didn't say anything for a while, and nobody in that room said anything either. That's the price, friend. That's what "she stayed dead by choice" actually means when you stop saying it like a movie tagline and start counting the cost out in real days and real people. It means a phone you never pick up. It means a funeral you watch from 10,000 miles away. It means your father goes into the ground thinking he failed to bring you home, when the truth is you'd done the impossible and survived, and you loved him too much and believed in the work too much to ease his grief. There are people who'll tell you what she did was a kind of selfishness, that she had no right to make that choice for her mother, for her father. I've gone back and forth on it myself, honestly. But I keep landing in the same place, which is this: she didn't do it for herself. Whatever else you say about it, you cannot say she did it for herself. She got nothing out of staying dead except the ability to keep working and the certainty that she was protecting the people she loved from a circus that would have eaten them alive. A selfish person takes the rescue. A selfish person makes the call, comes home a hero, gets the parade and the book deal and a spot on the morning shows. Liv Marchetti had all of that available to her, sitting right there for the taking, and she turned it down for 11 years to stay in the dark and do the work. I don't know what to call that except the loneliest kind of courage there is. By 2020, the wars were winding down in the way wars do, which is to say messily, and without anyone really deciding it was over. The networks she'd worked were changing. The whole architecture of the conflict was shifting under everyone's feet, and the specific value of a ghost in that specific theater was starting to run out. She'd been at it for over a decade. She was in her 40s now, and her body, that shoulder that never healed right, the deep ache in her side, the accumulated wear of 11 years of living rough in the worst places on the planet, her body was starting to file its own complaints. And the man who'd been her handler,
who'd believed her and built the whole impossible arrangement around her, was rotating out, and the question of what to do with an asset who didn't officially exist became a real bureaucratic problem for the first time, because the people who'd known the secret were aging out of the positions where they'd been able to protect it. There was a real possibility, and I want to be honest about this, that Olivia Marchetti would simply stay a ghost forever. That she'd be quietly resettled somewhere under some thin cover, given a new life that wasn't hers, and allowed to disappear for good, not dead, exactly, but never again Olivia Marchetti either. A third option, neither alive nor dead, just gone. There were people in the system who thought that was the cleanest solution. No spectacle. No awkward questions about why a dead woman had been operating in theater for a decade. No need to explain to a grieving family why they'd been allowed to grieve. Just let the ghost stay a ghost, permanently, and close the file. And it might have gone that way. It very nearly did. Except for one man who had spent 13 years unable to forgive himself for an order he gave in an alley in Anbar province. Except for Frank Aiello. Frank Aiello had not let her go. That's the simplest way to say it, and it's the truest. 13 years, and the man had never once been able to set down the weight of that withdrawal order. He'd left a soldier behind. It didn't matter that it was the right call, that staying would have killed half the team, that every board and every review and every honest man who looked at it told him he'd done the only thing a commander could do. It didn't matter that she'd been awarded the Silver Star for the very act of buying her team's escape with her life. None of that touched the thing that lived in Frank Aiello's chest, which was simply this: she was mine, and I left her there. He'd made captain, then major, then lieutenant colonel. He'd stayed in, done the full career, and somewhere along the way the leaving her behind had stopped being just grief and become something more like a low fire that never went out, a thing that drove him. He'd kept tabs on her family over the years, the way some men do. He'd gone to Sal Marchetti's funeral, stood in the back of that church in Hoboken, paid his respects to Rosa, told her what her daughter had done at that corner, what it had meant, how many men were alive because of her. He'd appointed himself, quietly, the keeper of Olivia Marchetti's memory, and he tended it like a man tends a grave. And then, late in his career, Frank Aiello ended up in a position with access, the kind of senior position where the compartments start to overlap, where a man who's been around long enough and climbed high enough starts to catch the edges of things he was never read into. I'm not going to tell you exactly how he caught the thread, because I don't fully know, and the part one do know is still behind that black bar. But somewhere, in some after-action summary, or some source reporting chain, or some anomaly in an operation he was reviewing, Frank Aiello saw something that didn't fit. A pattern of human intelligence out of a region, and a population that no documented asset should have been able to reach. A particular texture to the reporting, an emphasis on the women's networks, a way of reading a village that he recognized, because he'd watched somebody work exactly that way once, a long time ago, in the worst year of his life. He couldn't have told you what made him sure. He'd say later it was a feeling, and then he'd correct himself, because Frank Aiello didn't trust feelings, and he'd say it was the accumulation of small things that his gut assembled into a conclusion before his head caught up. But he became convinced, obsessed, his wife would say, in the months it took him to run it down, that the source behind a certain stream of reporting was a dead woman. He started pulling threads. He used every bit of rank and access and accumulated favor he had. He made himself, I'm told, a considerable nuisance to some people who very much did not want this particular grave disturbed. And eventually, because he would not stop and because he had the standing to force the question. Somebody senior enough had to sit Frank Aiello down in a room and decide whether to lie to a lieutenant colonel's face or tell him the truth. They told him the truth. I've thought a lot about that moment, the moment somebody confirmed it to him, and I keep coming back to the fact that it must have been the strangest grief and the strangest joy a man can feel at the same time. 13 years of carrying a death that turned out not to be a death. The order he'd hated himself for. It hadn't killed her. She'd lived. She'd been alive that whole time, the entire 13 years he'd spent mourning her, and she'd been doing exactly the kind of work that he, of all people, understood and revered. He didn't fail her in that alley. She'd survived. She'd done the impossible, and then she'd done something more impossible than that. I imagine the relief of it nearly took his legs out from under him. And then I imagine the second wave hit, which was, she's been alive for 13 years, and nobody told her family, and nobody brought her home. And that's the thing Frank Aiello could not abide. Not the staying dead. He understood that. Professional to professional, he understood every reason she'd done it, and he respected it the way you respect a hard call made for the right reasons. What he could not abide was the third option, the quiet one, the resettle her as a ghost forever and close the file option. The plan, half formed in certain offices, to let Olivia Marchetti simply never come home at all. To let Rosa Marchetti die someday still believing she'd buried her daughter. To let the woman who'd held at corner spend the rest of her life under some borrowed name in some borrowed town, neither dead nor alive, a problem that had been solved by erasure. Frank Aiello had left her behind once. He'd carried it for 13 years. And he made up his mind, with the full stubborn force of a man getting a second chance at the one thing he'd never forgiven himself for, that he was not going to leave her behind again. So he fought. He fought the bureaucracy. He fought the people who wanted the clean solution. He fought the entirely legitimate security concerns about surfacing an asset, the political concerns, the institutional discomfort of a story this strange and this hard to explain. He fought it through the proper channels, with the patience and the rank and the dogged procedural correctness of a man who'd learned how to move an institution. And his argument, in the end, was simple, and it was an argument no honest soldier could really answer. He said, "We have a covenant. We do not leave our people behind. We tell that to every recruit. We carve it into our institutional soul. We send men to die to recover the dead because of it. And here is a woman who held a corner alone so that 2 of our wounded could live, who survived 9 nights of crawling through enemy territory, who spent 11 years dead so she could keep serving. And you want to tell me that the reward for all of that is that she never gets to go home? That her mother never gets to know? That we honor the most extraordinary act of service any of us has ever seen by deciding it's administratively inconvenient to bring her back?" He won. It took him the better part of a year, but he won. And that's how Olivia Marchetti came to be sitting in a conference room. A real one, fluorescent lights and bad carpet, and a long table, the most ordinary room in the world for the least ordinary debrief any of those people had ever conducted. That's the room I keep coming back to, the room where she said, "I came home, Pop, I just couldn't tell you," and went quiet. They brought her in carefully, over weeks, the resurrection of a dead woman being a delicate thing to manage. There were the debriefings, the verification, the slow, careful work of confirming that the ghost was who she said she was, though anyone who'd known her needed about 4 seconds in a room with her to be sure. The shoulder. The watch. The way she read everybody in the room before she'd said a word. And there was the moment Frank Aiello walked into that room and saw her for the first time in 13 years. I wasn't there for that, and I wouldn't tell you about it if I had been, because some things belong only to the people in the room. I'll only say that two people who'd each spent more than a decade believing they'd failed the other, him for leaving her for the funeral she'd let him attend believing a lie, got to stand in front of each other, alive, and discover that neither of them had failed anybody at all. They'd both done the hardest right thing available to them, and they'd both carried it as a wound, and it turned out the wound was the proof of how much they'd loved each other all along. Paisani. Brother and sister in the way the word actually means. The very last part, the part one think about most, is the drive to Hoboken. Because somebody had to tell Rosa. You don't do that over a phone. You don't send a letter. After 13 years, you get in a car, and you drive to a row house in New Jersey, and you knock on the door, and you stand on the step where a casualty notification officer once stood and ruined her life, and this time you give it back to her. Frank Aiello drove her there himself. Of course he did. He'd carried the daughter's memory to that house once already, to a funeral and to a father's wake. It was only right that he be the one to bring the daughter back to it, alive, in the passenger seat, clutching her grandfather's watch and shaking like she never shook under fire. I don't know exactly what was said when that door opened. I know Rosa Marchetti was an old woman by then, widowed, who'd buried a husband and a daughter and built whatever peace a person can build on top of that much loss. I know she opened her door to find that daughter standing on the step, gray now at the temples, a little broken in the shoulder, 13 years older than the photograph on the mantel. And I know that whatever those two women said to each other in that doorway is the only part of this entire story that I have absolutely no right to, and neither do you, and neither does anyone. That one's just theirs. But I'll tell you how I think about the whole thing now that you've heard it all. People want this to be a story about toughness, about the ditch and the crawling and the 11 years in the dark, and it is, but that's the surface. Underneath, it's a story about covenants. It's about the small covenant Liv kept with a sick child's father in a village she'd half forgotten, which came back 18 months later and saved her life. It's about the brutal covenant she kept with her team at that corner, trading her own life for two of theirs. It's about the strange, lonely covenant she kept with the work, staying dead for 11 years to keep faith with a mission and a program and the women coming up behind her. And it's about the oldest covenant of all, the one Frank Aiello refused to break twice. We do not leave our people behind, which is the thread that ran through all 13 years and finally, in a conference room with bad carpet, pulled her all the way home. She kept faith with everybody, you see. Yusuf, her team, the mission, her father's last instruction in that garage. Come home, whatever it takes. It took 13 years, and a death and a resurrection. But she came home. And the only reason she made it the last few feet up that doorstep is that one man loved her enough to never accept that she was gone. That's the whole story, friend. That's the part that matters. The rest is just the things that happened.